My name is Emma Walsh, and for most of my life, I believed I was the mistake that ruined a perfect family. The illegitimate daughter. The reminder of my father's infidelity. The child who should never have existed. I grew up in a small apartment in Queens with my mother, Linda Walsh, a woman who cleaned office buildings at night to pay our rent. Mom was beautiful in a tired, worn-down way, the kind of beauty that spoke of dreams deferred and sacrifices made. She had long auburn hair that she always kept pulled back in a practical bun, green eyes that sparkled when she laughed, which wasn't often, and hands that were permanently stained from years of industrial cleaning products. "Your father is a very important man," she used to tell me when I was little, usually after I'd asked why he didn't live with us like other kids' dads. "He has responsibilities, a family he has to take care of. But he loves you, Emma. Never doubt that." Charles Blackwood was indeed a very important man. He owned Blackwood Industries, a manufacturing company that had been in his family for 3 generations. They made precision instruments for hospitals and laboratories, not glamorous, but incredibly profitable. The Blackwood name was synonymous with success in our city. They lived in Riverside Heights, the kind of neighborhood where houses had names instead of just addresses, where the lawns were always perfect and the driveways were always filled with luxury cars. I saw pictures of their house once, when I was 12 and curious enough to ride my bike across town just to see where my father lived. It was a sprawling Tudor-style mansion with ivy climbing the walls and a circular driveway that could have fit our entire apartment. As I stood there staring through the iron gates, a woman in a white Mercedes pulled up. She had perfectly styled blonde hair and wore clothes that probably cost more than my mother made in a month. That was Victoria Blackwood, my father's wife. The woman who had given him 2 legitimate children, my half-siblings, Catherine and Michael. Even from a distance, I could see she had the kind of effortless elegance that money could buy. She glanced at me through her car window as the gates opened, and for just a moment, our eyes met. Her expression changed from casual curiosity to something much colder, like she knew exactly who I was and exactly how much she despised my existence. I pedaled home as fast as I could, my heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and shame. I had seen where I came from, where I belonged, and the message was clear: I didn't. My father visited us maybe once a month, always unannounced, always looking slightly uncomfortable in our cramped living room with its second-hand furniture and water-stained ceiling. Charles Blackwood was a tall, imposing man with silver hair and the kind of commanding presence that made people listen when he spoke. Even in our shabby apartment, wearing casual clothes instead of his usual business suits, he seemed larger than life. "How's school, Emma?" he'd always ask, sitting stiffly on our worn-out couch while my mother bustled around making coffee she couldn't afford. "Good," I'd answer, because that's what you were supposed to say. I never told him about the kids who made fun of my second-hand clothes or the teachers who looked at me with pity when I couldn't afford field trips. I never mentioned how hard my mother worked or how she sometimes cried when she thought I was asleep, counting and recounting the bills she couldn't pay. Instead, I told him about my grades, always excellent, my reading, voracious, and my dreams, carefully edited to seem appropriately modest. He'd nod approvingly and reach into his wallet, pulling out a few $100 bills that he'd hand to my mother with instructions to buy Emma something nice. "You're a smart girl," he'd tell me before leaving. "Study hard, stay out of trouble, and you'll make something of yourself." The implication was always there. I'd have to make something of myself because I couldn't rely on him or his family name to open doors for me. I was on my own. When I was 16, I finally met my half-siblings face to face. It was completely by accident. I was working part-time at a bookstore downtown to help my mother with expenses, and Catherine and Michael walked in with a group of their friends from their expensive private school. Catherine was everything I wasn't. Blonde, polished, confident in the way that only comes from never doubting your place in the world. She was my age but seemed years older, carrying herself with the kind of poise that money and privilege instill from birth. Michael was 2 years younger, but already had that same entitled air, the casual arrogance of someone who'd never wanted for anything. I watched them from behind the register, my hands shaking as I pretended to organize receipt paper. They were laughing about something, their voices carrying the easy camaraderie of people who'd never had to worry about anything more serious than which college to attend or which car to drive. "Can we help you find anything?" my coworker asked them. "Just browsing," Catherine said with a dismissive smile. "Looking for something interesting to read." They wandered around the store for 20 minutes, occasionally picking up books and making comments about the authors or the subject matter. I listened to every word, hungry for any insight into their lives, their world, the family I'd never really be part of. As they were leaving, Michael dropped his wallet near the register. I bent down to pick it up, and when I stood to hand it back to him, he really looked at me for the first time. "Thanks," he said, then paused, his brow furrowing slightly. "Do I know you? You look familiar." My heart stopped. We had the same eyes, Charles Blackwood's eyes, deep brown with flecks of gold. We had the same strong chin, the same way of tilting our heads when we were thinking. Standing that close, the family resemblance was unmistakable. "I don't think so," I managed to say, handing him his wallet. Catherine had turned back to see what was taking so long. She looked at me, then at Michael, and I saw the exact moment recognition dawned in her eyes. Her face went pale, then flushed with what looked like anger. "Michael, come on," she said sharply, grabbing his arm. "We're going to be late." As they left, I heard her hiss something to him under her breath. Whatever she said made him look back at me through the store window with a mixture of curiosity and disgust. That night, I asked my mother about my father's other children. "They're not your concern, Emma," she said, not looking up from the bills she was paying at our kitchen table. "You have your own life to worry about." "But they're my family too, aren't they? My brother and sister?" Mom's pen stopped moving. She sat back in her chair and looked at me with tired eyes. "Half-siblings," she corrected. "And no, honey, they're not your family. Not really. They live in a different world than we do." "What if I tried to talk to them? What if I—" "Emma," her voice was sharp now, sharper than I'd ever heard it. "Listen to me very carefully. Those people will never accept you. They see you as a threat, as something that could damage their perfect family image. The best thing you can do is stay away from them and focus on building your own life." I wanted to argue, to insist that family was family regardless of circumstances, but something in my mother's expression stopped me. She looked frightened, like she knew something I didn't. It would be another 12 years before I understood what she was trying to protect me from. I threw myself into my education with the kind of desperate intensity that comes from knowing it's your only way out. I graduated valedictorian from my public high school, earned a full scholarship to Columbia University, and completed a degree in business administration with a minor in finance. I wasn't just going to make something of myself, I was going to prove that Charles Blackwood's bastard daughter was just as capable as his legitimate children. Throughout college, my father continued his monthly visits, now showing more interest in my academic achievements. He seemed genuinely proud when I made the dean's list, and I caught him bragging about my scholarship to my mother once when he thought I wasn't listening. "She's got real potential, Linda," he said. "Reminds me of myself at that age, hungry, determined, not willing to accept limitations." "She gets that from you," my mother replied quietly. "The good parts, anyway." I graduated magna cum laude in 2018, and immediately started job hunting in New York's financial district. My father offered to make some calls, to put in a word for me at various companies, but I refused. I wanted to earn everything on my own merit, without any help from the Blackwood name. It took me 6 months to land a position as a junior analyst at Morrison & Associates, a mid-sized investment firm. The salary wasn't huge, but it was enough to help my mother quit one of her cleaning jobs and move us to a better apartment in a safer neighborhood. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was making real progress. That's when my father started talking about the future. "You know, Emma," he said during one of his visits in early 2019, "I've been thinking about the company, about succession planning." My heart leaped. Was he finally going to acknowledge me publicly? Was I going to be included in the family business? Catherine's got her law degree now, and she's working at that firm downtown. Michael's finishing his MBA, and he'll probably want to come into the company within the next few years. But there might be room for someone with your financial background, someone who understands the numbers side of things. Really? I couldn't keep the hope out of my voice. "Maybe," he said carefully. "We'd have to see how things develop. It would depend on a lot of factors." I understood the subtext. It would depend on whether his legitimate family would accept me, whether the scandal of acknowledging his illegitimate daughter was worth whatever value I might bring to the company. But it was something, a possibility. A chance to finally be part of the family I'd always wanted to belong to. Over the next few months, I threw myself into learning everything I could about Blackwood Industries. I studied their financial reports, researched their competitors, analyzed market trends in their sector. I wanted to be ready when the opportunity came. My father seemed impressed by my initiative. During his visits, he started discussing business challenges with me, asking for my thoughts on potential expansions or cost-cutting measures. I felt like we were finally building a real relationship, like I was earning my place in his world through competence and dedication. I should have known it was too good to be true. In September 2019, my mother was diagnosed with breast cancer. The doctors caught it early, they said, but she'd need surgery, chemotherapy, and extensive follow-up care. Even with insurance, the medical bills would be staggering. I called my father immediately. "I need help," I told him, something I'd never said before in my life. "Mom's sick, and I can't cover all the medical expenses on my salary. I know you've helped us before, but this is different. This is life or death." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Of course, Emma. Your mother, Linda's a good woman. I'll take care of the medical bills." "Thank you," I said, tears streaming down my face. "Thank you so much." "There is one thing, though," he said, and something in his tone made my stomach clench. "I think it might be best if you didn't mention this arrangement to anyone. You know how complicated things can be with family finances." I agreed without thinking. I was so grateful for his help, so relieved that my mother would get the care she needed, that I didn't question why he wanted secrecy. My mother's treatment was successful. The surgery went well, the chemotherapy was brutal but effective, and by early 2020, she was declared cancer-free. Throughout the entire ordeal, Charles Blackwood paid every medical bill without complaint. He even arranged for private nurses during her recovery and made sure she had access to the best oncologists in the city. "He really does love us," my mother said one day as she was recovering from her final chemotherapy session. "In his own way, he really does care." I agreed. How could I not? He had stepped up when we needed him most, had proven that despite the complicated circumstances of our relationship, we mattered to him. I was wrong about so many things. In March 2020, just as the world was shutting down due to COVID-19, my father had a massive heart attack while playing golf at his country club. He was rushed to the hospital, but the damage was too severe. Charles Blackwood died at age 62, leaving behind a business empire, a grieving widow, 2 legitimate children, and 1 illegitimate daughter who found out about his death by reading his obituary in the newspaper 3 days later. They hadn't even told me he was sick. They hadn't called me when he died. They hadn't invited me to the funeral. I sat in my apartment, staring at the newspaper article about Charles Blackwood's sudden passing and his beloved family, Victoria, Catherine, and Michael. There was no mention of me, no acknowledgement that he had another daughter who had loved him despite everything. The funeral was described as a private service for immediate family only. I wasn't immediate family, apparently. I was nothing. That's when I realized that all those years of monthly visits, all those conversations about business and the future, all that help with my mother's medical bills, none of it had been about love or family or acceptance. It had been about keeping me quiet, keeping me satisfied, keeping me from making demands or causing problems for his real family. I was Charles Blackwood's dirty little secret, and now that he was dead, there was no reason to pretend otherwise. Chapter 2: The Will Reading That Never Came. The weeks following my father's death were a blur of grief, anger, and confusion. I kept expecting someone to call, maybe Victoria, maybe one of my half-siblings, maybe the family lawyer. Someone had to acknowledge that Charles Blackwood had another daughter, that I existed, that I deserved at least the courtesy of knowing what was happening with his estate. No one called. I went back to work at Morrison & Associates, but I couldn't concentrate. My colleagues offered their condolences when I told them about my father's death, but I couldn't explain the complicated nature of our relationship. How do you tell people that your father died and you weren't even notified? How do you explain that you're grieving someone who apparently didn't consider you family enough to include in his final arrangements? My mother tried to comfort me, but she was dealing with her own complex emotions. She had loved Charles Blackwood for nearly 30 years, had raised his child, had accepted his limited presence in our lives without complaint. His death was devastating for her too, but she grieved quietly, privately, the way she'd lived their entire relationship. "Maybe it's for the best, Emma," she said one evening as we sat in her apartment, both of us staring at the TV without really watching. "Maybe this is a chance for you to move on, to build a life that doesn't depend on his approval or acceptance." "But what about his will?" I asked. "Surely he left something for me, some acknowledgement that I was his daughter?" Mom was quiet for a long moment. "Honey, you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that he didn't. Charles lived in 2 separate worlds, the public one with his wife and legitimate children, and the private one with us. He might not have been able to bridge those worlds, even in death." I refused to accept that. This was the man who had paid for my mother's cancer treatment, who had talked to me about joining the family business, who had told me I reminded him of himself. He wouldn't just forget about me in his will. After 2 months of waiting, I finally hired a lawyer, Rebecca Martinez, a sharp, no-nonsense attorney who specialized in estate law. I paid her consultation fee with money I couldn't really afford and laid out the whole complicated story of my relationship with Charles Blackwood. "I need to know what's in his will," I told her. "I need to know if he remembered me." Rebecca listened carefully, taking notes in neat handwriting. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and studied me with dark, intelligent eyes. "Emma, I need to ask you some difficult questions," she said. "Do you have any legal proof that Charles Blackwood was your father?" "What do you mean?" "Birth certificate, paternity test, legal acknowledgement of any kind?" I shook my head. "My birth certificate lists my father as unknown. Charles never legally acknowledged me as his daughter. It was always just, understood." "Understood by whom?" "By him, by my mother, by me. He visited us regularly. He helped support us financially. But there's no paper trail, Rebecca interrupted gently. No legal documentation that establishes paternity. The implications of what she was saying began to sink in. Are you telling me I have no legal claim to anything? I'm telling you that without legal proof of paternity, you have no standing to contest his will or demand information about his estate. In the eyes of the law, you're not his daughter. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. But I am his daughter. I know I am. Anyone who looks at me and Michael can see the resemblance. Resemblance isn't legal proof, Rebecca said. If you want to pursue this, we'd need to establish paternity first. That would mean getting a DNA sample from Charles Blackwood or from one of his confirmed relatives. He's been dead for 2 months. How am I supposed to get a DNA sample? Exhumation is theoretically possible, but it's expensive, complicated, and requires either family consent or a court order. The more practical option would be getting a sample from one of his children, your half-siblings. I laughed bitterly. Catherine and Michael hate me. They barely acknowledged my existence when Charles was alive. They're not going to voluntarily provide DNA samples to help me claim part of their inheritance. Then you'd need to compel them through legal action, which again requires you to first establish some basis for believing you're entitled to make such a claim. It was a catch-22. I couldn't prove I was Charles Blackwood's daughter without DNA evidence, but I couldn't get DNA evidence without legal standing, which I didn't have without proof of paternity. What about the financial support he provided over the years? I asked desperately. Surely that proves something. It proves he gave your mother money, Rebecca said. It doesn't prove why. He could claim he was being charitable, or that he was paying for services rendered, or any number of other explanations that don't involve acknowledging paternity. I left Rebecca's office feeling more hopeless than I had since Charles's death. Not only was I not mentioned in his will, I had no legal right to even know what was in his will. Over the following weeks, I tried different approaches. I called Blackwood Industries, hoping to speak with someone who might have information about Charles's intentions regarding me. The receptionist was polite but firm. All questions about Mr. Blackwood's estate should be directed to the family's attorney. I called the family's attorney, Harrison, Wade and Associates, and got essentially the same response. They could not and would not discuss the details of Charles Blackwood's estate with anyone who was not a legal beneficiary or representative. Am I a beneficiary? I asked. I cannot provide that information to someone who is not already identified as having legal standing in this matter, the lawyer said in the kind of circular language that makes you want to scream. I even tried reaching out to Catherine and Michael directly. I found Catherine's law firm online and called her office. This is Emma Walsh, I told her secretary. I need to speak with Catherine Blackwood about a family matter. There was a pause. Then, Ms. Blackwood is not available to take calls regarding family matters. All such inquiries should be directed to the family's legal representatives. I tried Michael next, calling the main number at Blackwood Industries and asking to speak with him. Michael Blackwood is in meetings all day, his assistant said. May I ask what this is regarding? It's about his father's estate. I'm Emma Walsh, and I'm sorry, but Mr. Blackwood is not taking calls about estate matters. You'll need to contact Harrison, Wade and Associates. It was like they had coordinated their responses, like they had anticipated that I might try to contact them and had prepared a unified strategy for shutting me out. 6 months after Charles's death, I was no closer to answers than I had been the day I read his obituary. I didn't know what was in his will, I couldn't prove my paternity, and I had no legal recourse for finding out information about my own father's estate. That's when I started thinking about doing my own investigation. I began with public records. Charles Blackwood's will had been filed with the probate court, which meant it was public information. I spent a Saturday morning at the courthouse, filling out forms and paying fees to access the documents. Reading my father's will was one of the most painful experiences of my life. Charles Blackwood had left everything to his beloved wife Victoria and his cherished children Catherine and Michael. The language was formal but warm, describing his pride in his family and his confidence in their ability to continue his legacy. He left specific bequests: his watch collection to Michael, his mother's jewelry to Catherine, his personal papers and photographs to Victoria. There was no mention of me. Not even a footnote. Not even a small bequest that might have acknowledged my existence while protecting his family's privacy. It was as if Emma Walsh had never existed in Charles Blackwood's life. But there was something else in the will that caught my attention, a reference to a trust fund that had been established for the benefit of parties requiring discretionary support as determined by the trustees. The trust was funded with $2 million. And Victoria and Catherine were named as trustees with full discretion over distributions. Could that trust have been meant for me? Was it Charles's way of providing for me without explicitly naming me in his will? I brought the will to Rebecca Martinez, hoping she could help me understand the implications of the discretionary trust. "It's possible," she said after reviewing the documents. "Discretionary trusts are sometimes used to provide for people who can't be named directly in a will for privacy or family reasons. But without being explicitly named as a beneficiary, you'd have no legal right to demand distributions or even information about the trust's activities. So even if this trust was meant for me, Victoria and Catherine could just ignore me forever?" Theoretically, yes. If you're not a named beneficiary, the trustees have no legal obligation to even acknowledge your existence, let alone provide you with financial support. I stared at the will, reading and rereading the trust provisions. $2 million, sitting there with vague language about discretionary support and parties requiring assistance. It felt like Charles trying to have it both ways, providing for me financially while maintaining plausible deniability about my relationship to him. "What would it take to challenge this?" I asked. "You'd need to establish that you were intended to be a beneficiary of the trust," Rebecca said. "That would likely require proving paternity, which brings us back to the DNA issue. It would also require demonstrating that the trust was established with you in mind, which would be difficult without testimony from Charles himself or evidence of his intentions. What about the financial support he provided over the years? What about the medical bills he paid for my mother? Those payments could support your case, but they're not definitive proof. The other side could argue that Charles was simply being charitable, or that there were other reasons for the support that didn't involve acknowledging paternity." I left Rebecca's office more determined than ever to find a way to prove my relationship to Charles Blackwood. If I couldn't get DNA from him or his legitimate children, I'd have to find another way. That's when I remembered something. Charles had mentioned having a brother who died in Vietnam, and that brother had a son who lived somewhere in California. My Uncle Danny, who I'd never met but who shared my grandfather's DNA. If I could find Danny Blackwood and convince him to take a DNA test, I could prove my relationship to the Blackwood family through their shared genetics. It wasn't ideal, but it might be enough to establish legal standing. I spent weeks searching online, using genealogy websites and public records to track down Daniel Danny Blackwood Jr., son of Charles's deceased brother Daniel Sr. I finally found him living in Sacramento, working as a high school teacher and wrestling coach. I called him on a Tuesday evening in October 2020, 6 months after Charles's death. My hands were shaking as I dialed the number. "Danny Blackwood?" "Yeah, who's this?" "My name is Emma Walsh. I think Charles Blackwood was my father." There was a long pause. "Charlie? My Uncle Charlie?" "Yes, I know this sounds crazy, but I think we might be cousins. I'm trying to prove my paternity, and I was hoping you might be willing to take a DNA test. Danny was quiet for a moment. Jesus, Charlie never mentioned having another kid. It's complicated, I said. I was born outside of his marriage. He supported me and my mother, but he never acknowledged me publicly. And now you want to claim part of his estate? The blunt question caught me off guard. I want to know the truth, I said. I want to know if he remembered me in his will, if he made provisions for me. I can't even find out what's in his will because I can't prove I'm his daughter. Danny sighed heavily. Look, Emma, I'm sorry for your situation, but I don't really want to get involved in family drama. Charlie and I weren't that close. I maybe saw him once every 5 years at family reunions. Getting in the middle of an inheritance dispute sounds like a good way to make enemies. I'm not asking you to get in the middle of anything, I said desperately. I just need to establish paternity. One DNA test, that's all. You'd never have to deal with any of this again. I don't know, Danny said. Let me think about it. He never called me back. By the end of 2020, I was out of options and nearly out of money. The legal fees were adding up, and I wasn't any closer to proving my paternity or accessing information about Charles's estate. My mother was still recovering from her cancer treatment, and I was working 60-hour weeks just to keep up with our expenses. I was ready to give up. Charles Blackwood had managed to keep me a secret in life, and apparently, he was going to keep me a secret in death too. That's when I got an unexpected call from someone I'd never heard of, a man named Marcus Chen, who identified himself as Charles Blackwood's former business partner. I heard through mutual acquaintances that you might be Charlie's daughter, he said. I was wondering if we could meet for coffee. There are some things about your father that you might want to know. Marcus Chen was not what I expected. When I imagined Charles Blackwood's business associates, I pictured men in expensive suits with firm handshakes and calculated smiles. Marcus was probably in his mid-60s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the sort of gentle demeanor that made you want to trust him immediately. We met at a small cafe in Midtown Manhattan, far from the financial district where I worked and far from the upscale neighborhoods where the Blackwood family lived. Marcus was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with 2 cups of coffee and a manila folder. Emma? He asked as I approached, standing to shake my hand. Thank you for meeting me. I wasn't sure you'd come. To be honest, I wasn't sure either, I said, settling into the chair across from him. I've had a lot of dead ends lately when it comes to information about my father. Marcus nodded sympathetically. I imagine the family hasn't been particularly welcoming. That's putting it mildly. They won't even acknowledge that I exist. That doesn't surprise me, Marcus said, opening the manila folder. The Blackwoods have always been very concerned with appearances, with maintaining their reputation. Charlie was no different in that regard. He pulled out a photograph and slid it across the table. It showed 2 young men in their 20s, both wearing military uniforms. One of them was clearly Charles Blackwood. I recognized his strong jaw and intense eyes. The other man looked similar but softer somehow, with lighter hair and a gentler expression. That's your father on the left, Marcus said. The other man is his older brother, Daniel. Danny's father, I said, remembering my unsuccessful attempt to contact my potential cousin. Yes, Daniel died in Vietnam in 1971, when Charlie was just 22. It devastated him. They were very close, despite being quite different personalities. Marcus pulled out another photograph, this one showing 3 people, Charles, Daniel, and a young woman with dark hair and a bright smile. That's Linda Chen, Marcus said. My daughter. I stared at the photograph, confused. Your daughter? Linda was engaged to Daniel when he died, Marcus continued. They were planning to marry when he returned from his tour of duty. She was heartbroken when we got the news about his death, but Charlie stepped up. He helped her through her grief, helped her figure out what to do next. I don't understand, I said. What does this have to do with me? Marcus leaned forward, his expression becoming more serious. Emma, what I'm about to tell you is going to be difficult to hear. It's going to change everything you think you know about your father, about your family, about yourself. My heart started pounding. What are you talking about? Your mother's name is Linda Walsh now, but her maiden name was Linda Chin. She's my daughter, Emma, and she wasn't involved with Charles Blackwood the way you've been told. The coffee shop seemed to spin around me. I gripped the edge of the table, trying to process what Marcus was saying. That's impossible, I whispered. My mother's name is Linda Walsh. She's been with Charles for almost 30 years. She told me. She told you what she thought was best, Marcus said gently. What she thought would protect you. He pulled out more documents from the folder, birth certificates, marriage licenses, legal papers I couldn't immediately identify. Linda Chin married Daniel Blackwood in a small ceremony in February 1971, just before he shipped out to Vietnam. When he died 4 months later, she was already pregnant. I stared at the marriage certificate, seeing my mother's signature next to Daniel Blackwood's, seeing the date that put the timeline months before my birth. No, I said, shaking my head. No, that's not right. Charles is my father. I look like him. I have his eyes. You have the Blackwood eyes, Marcus corrected. Daniel's eyes. Charles's eyes. The family resemblance runs strong in that bloodline. He showed me another photograph, Daniel Blackwood without his military uniform, smiling at the camera with those same deep brown eyes I saw in the mirror every day. Emma, Charles Blackwood isn't your father, Marcus said softly. Daniel Blackwood is your father. You're not the illegitimate daughter of a married man. You're the legitimate daughter of a war hero who died before he could meet you. The implications hit me like a physical blow. If Daniel was my father, then Charles was my uncle. Catherine and Michael weren't my half-siblings, they were my cousins. Victoria wasn't my father's wife who hated his bastard child. She was my uncle's wife who had been protecting her family from what she thought was Charles's illegitimate daughter. Why didn't anyone tell me? I asked, my voice barely audible. Why did my mother let me believe Charles was my father all these years? Marcus sighed heavily. Because Charles asked her to. After Daniel died, Charlie took responsibility for Linda and for you. He felt guilty about surviving when his brother didn't, guilty about not being able to bring Daniel home. Taking care of his brother's family was his way of honoring Daniel's memory. But why the secrecy? Why not just acknowledge that I was Daniel's daughter? Because Charlie was already engaged to Victoria by then, and the Blackwood family was very traditional, very concerned with propriety. Having a war widow and her child as part of the family was one thing, but explaining the situation publicly would have been complicated. It was easier to let people assume you were Charles's illegitimate daughter than to explain the truth. I thought about all those years of feeling like an outsider, all those moments when I'd felt ashamed of my origins, all the times I'd wished I could be a real part of the Blackwood family. I was always a real part of the family, I said, the realization dawning slowly. I was never the bastard child. I was Daniel's daughter, Charles's niece. I belonged there all along. You did, Marcus confirmed. But Charlie made a choice to protect his marriage and his public reputation by maintaining the fiction that you were his illegitimate child rather than his legitimate niece. And my mother went along with this? Your mother was 22 years old, widowed, pregnant, and devastated by grief, Marcus said. Charlie offered her financial security and a way to raise her child without the stigma of being a single mother. At the time, it probably seemed like the best option. I stared at the documents spread across the table, proof of my parents' marriage, proof of my legitimacy, proof that everything I believed about my identity was wrong. Does the current family know? I asked. Do Victoria and Catherine and Michael know the truth? Marcus shook his head. I don't think so. Charlie was very good at keeping secrets, at compartmentalizing different parts of his life. He probably told Victoria some version of the story that protected his reputation while explaining why he felt obligated to help you and your mother financially. So they've spent all these years thinking I was Charles's bastard child, treating me like dirt because they thought I represented his infidelity? Most likely, yes. The anger that washed over me was unlike anything I'd ever felt. Not just anger at Charles for perpetuating this lie, but fury at the waste of it all, the years of shame, the missed opportunities for real family relationships, the way I'd been made to feel grateful for scraps when I should have been sitting at the table as an equal. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. Why didn't you speak up when Charles was alive? Marcus looked uncomfortable. Because Charlie asked me not to. He made me promise that I'd keep his secret, that I wouldn't interfere with the arrangement he'd made with Linda. I respected his wishes while he was alive, but now that he's gone. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I think you deserve to know the truth about who you are. What about my mother? Does she know you're here? No. Linda still believes that maintaining Charlie's version of events is the best thing for everyone. She's afraid that revealing the truth now will only cause more problems, more pain. I thought about my mother, quiet, long-suffering Linda, who had sacrificed so much to maintain a lie that protected other people's comfort at the expense of her daughter's identity. I need to confront her about this, I said. Be gentle with her, Emma. She did what she thought was right at the time, and she's lived with the consequences of that choice for 30 years. I gathered up the photographs and documents, my hands shaking. Can I keep these? They're copies. I thought you might need them. For what? Marcus met my eyes directly. For proving who you really are. For claiming what's rightfully yours. Daniel Blackwood was Charles's older brother and heir apparent to the family business before he died. As his legitimate daughter, you have a stronger claim to the Blackwood legacy than Catherine or Michael. The implications of what he was saying began to sink in. If I was Daniel's legitimate daughter, then I wasn't just entitled to be acknowledged by the family. I was potentially entitled to a substantial portion of Charles's estate. The will, I said suddenly. Charles's will mentioned a discretionary trust. Do you think? I think Charlie tried to do right by you in the only way his conscience would allow, Marcus said. But I also think he never intended for the truth to die with him. That evening, I drove to my mother's apartment with Marcus's documents burning a hole in my purse. I found her in the kitchen, preparing dinner with the methodical efficiency that came from years of making do with limited resources. Mom, we need to talk. She looked up from the vegetables she was chopping, immediately sensing the seriousness in my tone. What's wrong, honey? I spread the photographs and documents across her kitchen table. I met with Marcus Chen today. The color drained from my mother's face. She set down her knife and sank into the chair across from me, staring at the marriage certificate that bore her maiden name. Oh God, she whispered. Oh God, Emma, I can explain. Can you? I asked, trying to keep my voice level. Can you explain why you let me spend 28 years believing I was Charles Blackwood's illegitimate daughter? Can you explain why you let me feel ashamed of who I was when I was actually the legitimate daughter of a war hero? Tears started streaming down my mother's face. You don't understand. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. When Daniel died, I was lost. I was terrified. I didn't know how I was going to survive as a single mother. But you weren't a single mother, I said. You were a war widow. That's completely different. Charles offered to help, she continued. He said he'd take care of us, that he'd make sure you had everything you needed. All I had to do was let people think you were his child instead of Daniel's. Why would he want that? My mother wiped her eyes with a dish towel. Because acknowledging you as Daniel's daughter would have complicated things with his fiancée, with the family business, with his whole life plan. It was easier for everyone if you were just his illegitimate child that he was helping out of guilt. Easier for everyone except me. I thought it would be easier for you too, she said desperately. I thought having Charles as a father figure, even a distant one, would be better than having no father at all. But I did have a father, I said, picking up Daniel's photograph. I had a father who died serving his country, who married you because he loved you, who would have been proud to claim me as his daughter. Instead, I got to be the family embarrassment. My mother reached across the table, trying to take my hand. Emma, please understand. I was young, I was scared, I was grieving. Charles seemed like he was offering us a lifeline. He was offering himself a cover story, I corrected. He got to look magnanimous for supporting his illegitimate child while hiding the fact that he'd let his brother's widow and daughter live in poverty to protect his own reputation. We weren't in poverty, my mother protested. Charles made sure we had everything we needed. We lived in a one-bedroom apartment in Queens while his real family lived in a mansion, I said. You worked 2 jobs cleaning offices while his wife played tennis at the country club. We had enough to survive, but they had everything. The conversation continued for hours, with my mother trying to justify 3 decades of lies and me trying to understand how she could have agreed to such an arrangement. By the end of the night, I understood her motivations, but I couldn't forgive the choice she'd made. What are you going to do now? She asked as I prepared to leave. I'm going to get a DNA test, I said. I'm going to prove that Daniel Blackwood was my father. And then I'm going to claim my rightful place in the family. Emma, please think about this carefully. These people have believed one version of events for 30 years. Revealing the truth now is going to destroy relationships, cause terrible problems. Good, I said. Maybe it's time for some problems. Maybe it's time for some truth. The next morning, I called Rebecca Martinez and scheduled an emergency meeting. When I laid out Marcus's documents on her desk, her eyes widened with professional interest. This changes everything, she said after reviewing the marriage certificate and other papers. If you can prove that Daniel Blackwood was your father, you're not just entitled to information about Charles's estate, you could be entitled to a significant portion of it. What do you mean? Daniel was the older brother, right? The heir apparent to the family business? According to Marcus, yes. Then as his legitimate heir, you could have a claim to the inheritance that would have passed to him if he'd lived. Depending on how the family trusts and business holdings are structured, you might be entitled to more than Catherine and Michael. The idea was staggering. Not only was I Charles's legitimate niece rather than his illegitimate daughter, but I might actually be entitled to a larger share of the family fortune than the people who had spent years treating me like garbage. What's the first step? I asked. DNA test, Rebecca said immediately. We need definitive proof of your relationship to Daniel Blackwood. Once we have that, we can challenge Charles's will and demand a full accounting of the estate. I already tried to get Danny Blackwood to take a test. He refused. Then we'll have to find another way. Are there any other living relatives from Daniel's side of the family? I thought about it. Marcus mentioned that Daniel and Charles had a sister who moved to Florida, but I don't know her name or how to contact her. We'll find her, Rebecca said confidently. And if we can't find living relatives, there are other options. Hair samples, personal effects, anything that might contain Daniel's DNA. He died in 1971. What are the chances anything like that still exists? You'd be surprised what families keep, Rebecca said. Letters, clothing, personal items that were returned from overseas. It's worth investigating. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into genealogical research with the same intensity I'd once devoted to studying Charles's business. I created accounts on ancestry websites, searched military records, and tracked down every piece of information I could find about Daniel Blackwood's life and death. I found his military service records, which confirmed that he'd been killed in action in Vietnam in May 1971. I found the records of his marriage to Linda Chin in February of that same year. I found birth records, school records, even his high school yearbook photo, which showed a young man who looked remarkably like me. But I couldn't find any living relatives who were willing to help me prove my paternity. Danny Blackwood continued to refuse my calls. The sister Marcus had mentioned, Elizabeth Blackwood Morrison, had died 2 years earlier, according to her obituary. Her children, my potential second cousins, either couldn't be located or weren't interested in getting involved in family drama. I was beginning to think I'd hit another dead end when I received an unexpected call from someone I'd never heard of, a man named James Patterson, who identified himself as a genealogist specializing in military families. Ms. Walsh, I understand you're trying to establish your relationship to Daniel Blackwood, who died in Vietnam in 1971. Yes, I said cautiously. How did you know that? I've been researching Vietnam casualties for a documentary project, and Daniel Blackwood's case came to my attention. There are some unusual circumstances surrounding his death that you might find interesting. What kind of circumstances? I'd rather discuss this in person if possible. Are you available to meet this weekend? Something in his tone made me agree, though I couldn't shake the feeling that there were more secrets waiting to be uncovered. James Patterson turned out to be a soft-spoken man in his 50s, with the kind of meticulous attention to detail that comes from years of archival research. We met at his office in downtown Manhattan, a cluttered space filled with filing cabinets, computer monitors, and stacks of military records. Before we begin, he said, I need you to understand that what I'm about to show you might be difficult to process. I've been processing difficult information for months now, I said. I think I can handle it. James pulled out a thick folder and opened it to reveal military documents, correspondence, and photographs I'd never seen before. Daniel Blackwood didn't just die in Vietnam, he said. He died under circumstances that raised questions about the official report. What do you mean? According to the military records, Daniel was killed by enemy fire during a patrol on May 15, 1971. But according to eyewitness accounts from other soldiers in his unit, that's not what happened. James showed me photocopies of letters, interviews, and reports that painted a very different picture of Daniel's death. Daniel Blackwood was killed by friendly fire, James said quietly. Shot by another American soldier during what appears to have been a disagreement about military conduct. I stared at the documents, trying to process this new information. Why would that matter now? Because the soldier who killed Daniel Blackwood was Charles Blackwood. The world seemed to stop. What? Charles and Daniel were both in Vietnam at the same time, though in different units. According to witness statements, they encountered each other during a joint operation on May 15th. There was an argument about something, the witnesses weren't clear about what, and Charles shot his brother. I felt like I might vomit. That's impossible. Charles loved Daniel. He spent 30 years taking care of Daniel's family because he felt guilty about surviving when Daniel didn't. Charles felt guilty because he was the reason Daniel didn't survive, James said gently. The military covered it up to avoid scandal, 2 brothers serving their country, one killing the other over some unknown dispute. It was easier to list Daniel as killed by enemy action than to investigate a fratricide. The implications were staggering. Charles hadn't taken care of my mother and me out of brotherly love or survivor's guilt. He'd done it because he was the one responsible for making us a widow and an orphan in the first place. "How do you know all this?" I asked. "I specialize in cases where the official military records don't match eyewitness accounts," James said. Daniel Blackwood's case was flagged because several soldiers from his unit reached out to military historians over the years, saying the official story wasn't true. "Do you have proof?" "I have witness statements, correspondence, and military records that paint a very clear picture," James said. "But the smoking gun, so to speak, is this." He pulled out a photograph that made my blood run cold. It showed Charles Blackwood in military gear, holding a rifle, standing over what was clearly Daniel's body. "One of the soldiers took this picture before the official investigation team arrived," James said. "He kept it for 50 years before deciding that the truth needed to come out." I stared at the photograph, seeing my uncle standing over my father's corpse, and I understood everything. Charles hadn't spent 30 years caring for his brother's family out of love or duty. He'd done it out of guilt and fear, guilt over what he'd done, and fear that the truth might someday come to light. "I need copies of everything," I said. "I was hoping you'd say that," James said. "The truth about what happened to Daniel Blackwood deserves to be told." Chapter 4. The DNA Results That Changed Everything. Armed with James Patterson's evidence about Daniel's death and Marcus Chin's documents about my true parentage, I finally had the ammunition I needed to force the Blackwood family into acknowledging me. But I still needed definitive DNA proof, and I was running out of options for getting it. That's when Rebecca Martinez suggested something I hadn't considered. "What about your father's personal effects?" she asked during our weekly meeting. "When soldiers die overseas, their belongings are typically returned to the family. If Daniel had any personal items that were sent back to his wife, your mother, there might be DNA traces." I called my mother that evening, explaining what I needed without revealing what James Patterson had discovered about Daniel's death. I wasn't ready to tell her that Charles had killed her husband. I wasn't sure I'd ever be ready for that conversation. "Mom, do you still have any of Daniel's things? Anything that was sent back from Vietnam?" There was a long pause. "Why do you ask?" "I need DNA evidence to prove he was my father. If there's anything, clothing, personal items, anything that might have traces of his genetic material." "Emma, I don't think this is a good idea. Stirring up the past, challenging the family, it's only going to cause pain for everyone involved." "It's going to cause pain for people who have been lying for 30 years, I corrected. "What about me, Mom? What about the pain I've been carrying around, thinking I was the shameful secret that had to be hidden?" Another long pause. "There's a trunk in my closet," she said finally. "I kept some of his things, his letters, some photographs, a few personal items that were returned after he died. Can I come look through it?" "Emma. Please, Mom. I need to know who I really am. I need to prove it." She agreed reluctantly, and I drove to her apartment that same evening. The trunk was old and battered, tucked away in the back of her bedroom closet behind winter coats and boxes of Christmas decorations. When she pulled it out and opened it, the musty smell of decades-old memories filled the room. Inside were treasures I'd never known existed, letters Daniel had written to my mother during his brief deployment, photographs of him in uniform and in civilian clothes, and personal items that painted a picture of who my father had really been. There were books with his name written inside the covers, a watch that had belonged to his grandfather, a wallet with pictures of my mother tucked inside. And there, wrapped in tissue paper at the bottom of the trunk, was a hairbrush with several strands of dark hair still caught in the bristles. That was his, my mother said quietly, seeing me hold the brush. I couldn't bring myself to clean it out after we got the news. I carefully extracted several hairs from the brush, placing them in an envelope that Rebecca had provided. Finally, after months of searching, I had a DNA sample from Daniel Blackwood. The testing took 2 weeks. 2 weeks of waiting, wondering, hoping that science would finally give me the answers I'd been seeking for most of my life. When Rebecca called me at work on a Tuesday morning, I knew immediately from her tone that the results were significant. "Emma, you need to come to my office immediately," she said. "We need to discuss the DNA results." I left work early, claiming a family emergency, which wasn't exactly a lie, and rushed to Rebecca's office. She was waiting for me with the DNA report and an expression I couldn't quite read. "Well?" I asked before I'd even sat down. "The DNA confirms it," she said. "Daniel Blackwood was definitely your father. The genetic markers are conclusive. You're his legitimate daughter." I felt a mixture of relief and validation wash over me. After 28 years of doubt and shame, I finally had scientific proof of who I was. "But there's something else," Rebecca continued, and her tone made me nervous. "Something the lab found that they felt obligated to report." "What do you mean?" She handed me a second document. When they ran Daniel's DNA profile, they also compared it to the database of genetic markers from Charles Blackwood. How did they get Charles's DNA? It's standard practice in paternity cases involving deceased individuals. They use public databases, family genealogy sites, anything available. Charles apparently did a genetic test at some point and uploaded his results to one of those ancestry websites. I stared at the document, trying to understand what I was reading. "What does this say?" Rebecca took a deep breath. "Emma, according to these results, Daniel Blackwood and Charles Blackwood weren't brothers." "What?" "The genetic markers show that they were half-brothers at most, possibly not related at all. They didn't share the same father." The implications hit me like a freight train. If Charles and Daniel weren't full brothers, then the entire family dynamic was built on a lie. The Blackwood family legacy, the inheritance patterns, the business succession, everything was based on the assumption that Charles was the legitimate heir after Daniel's death. "Are you saying Charles wasn't really a Blackwood?" "I'm saying that either Charles wasn't a Blackwood, or Daniel wasn't, or they had different fathers," Rebecca said. "Without more extensive family DNA testing, it's impossible to know which scenario is correct." I thought about the family photographs Marcus had shown me, the physical resemblance between the two men, the way everyone had always accepted them as brothers. Could the results be wrong? It's possible, but unlikely. DNA testing is extremely accurate for determining paternal relationships. If two people share the same father, it shows up clearly in the genetic markers. Charles and Daniel's DNA profiles suggest they shared a mother but not a father. What does this mean for my inheritance claim? It potentially strengthens it significantly, Rebecca said with growing excitement. If Daniel was the legitimate Blackwood heir and Charles was not, then you're not just entitled to a portion of the estate, you could be entitled to the entire thing. The magnitude of what she was saying began to sink in. Not only was I not the illegitimate outsider I believed myself to be, but I might actually be the most legitimate heir to the Blackwood fortune. "We need more information," I said. "We need to understand the family history. Figure out who was really the biological son of the previous generation of Blackwoods." "I agree. But first, we need to use this information strategically. The current family doesn't know what we've discovered. They still think you're Charles's illegitimate daughter with no legal claim to anything." "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we schedule a meeting with their legal representatives and present our evidence all at once. The DNA proof of your relationship to Daniel, the documentation of your parents' marriage, and the questions about Charles's legitimacy. Hit them with everything simultaneously. What if they refuse to meet with us? Rebecca smiled. They won't refuse once we tell them what we know. The meeting was scheduled for the following Friday at the offices of Harrison, Wade and Associates, the law firm that had been handling Charles's estate. I spent the week preparing myself emotionally for what I knew would be a confrontation that could change everything. Victoria, Catherine, and Michael Blackwood arrived together, along with their lawyer, Richard Harrison, a distinguished man in his 70s who radiated the kind of authority that comes from decades of handling wealthy families' legal affairs. Ms. Walsh, Harrison said as Rebecca and I entered the conference room, I understand you believe you have some claim to the Blackwood estate. I don't believe I have a claim, I said, taking the seat across from my half-aunt and cousins. I know I have a claim. For the first time in my life, I was in the same room as Victoria, Catherine, and Michael as an equal, not as the supplicant begging for recognition. Victoria looked older than I remembered, her blonde hair now silver, and her face lined with stress. Catherine had inherited her mother's elegance but seemed brittle, like she might shatter if pressed too hard. Michael looked uncomfortable, avoiding my eyes and fidgeting with his phone. Rebecca began methodically laying out our case. She presented the marriage certificate proving Linda Chen's marriage to Daniel Blackwood. She showed the DNA results confirming Daniel as my father. She explained the legal implications of my legitimate birth and inheritance rights. This is preposterous, Harrison said when Rebecca finished her presentation. Even if these documents are authentic, they don't establish any claim to Charles Blackwood's estate. Charles was Daniel's brother, not his heir. That's where you're wrong, Rebecca said, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. Because Charles and Daniel weren't actually brothers. She presented the second DNA report, the one showing the lack of paternal relationship between Charles and Daniel. The silence in the room was deafening. Victoria went pale. That's impossible. They were brothers. Everyone knew they were brothers. Everyone believed they were brothers, I corrected. But belief and biology are two different things. What are you implying? Catherine asked, her voice shaking. I'm not implying anything, I said. I'm stating facts. Daniel Blackwood was the legitimate son of the previous generation. Charles was not. As Daniel's daughter, I'm the legitimate heir to the Blackwood fortune. Michael finally looked up from his phone. You're saying our father wasn't really a Blackwood? I'm saying the DNA evidence suggests that either your father or mine had a different biological father than the official family records indicate, I said. Given that Daniel died in military service and was acknowledged as the heir apparent, it seems more likely that Charles was the one who wasn't biologically related to the previous generation of Blackwoods. Harrison was frantically taking notes, clearly trying to process the legal implications. Even if this is true, he said, it doesn't necessarily invalidate Charles's inheritance or his will. He was raised as a Blackwood. He inherited the family business legally. Based on fraudulent representation of his parentage, Rebecca interrupted. If Charles knew he wasn't biologically a Blackwood and concealed that fact while claiming inheritance rights, that could be grounds for challenging every business decision and estate transfer he made over the past 40 years. You're talking about unwinding decades of legal transactions, Harrison protested. I'm talking about correcting decades of fraud, I replied. Victoria stood up abruptly, her composure finally cracking. This is insane. You can't just walk in here and claim our entire family legacy is based on lies. I'm not claiming it, I said calmly. I'm proving it. What do you want? Catherine asked quietly. What is this really about? I had been waiting for that question for months. I looked around the room at these people who had dismissed me, ignored me, treated me like I was beneath their notice. I want what was always rightfully mine, I said. I want recognition as Daniel Blackwood's legitimate daughter and heir. I want my fair share of the family business and estate. And I want acknowledgement of the 30 years of lies that kept me from knowing who I really was. And if we refuse? Michael asked. Then we'll see you in court, Rebecca said. And all of this becomes public record. Every DNA test, every forged document, every fraudulent inheritance claim. Is that really how you want the Blackwood family legacy to be remembered? Harrison requested a recess to consult privately with his clients. For 20 minutes, Rebecca and I sat alone in the conference room while heated discussions took place in the hallway outside. When they returned, Victoria looked like she'd aged 10 years. "What are your specific demands?" Harrison asked. Rebecca slid a document across the table. Full audit of the estate and business holdings. DNA testing of all family members to establish accurate lineage. Renegotiation of inheritance distributions based on legitimate claims. And public acknowledgement of Emma's status as Daniel Blackwood's heir. "This could bankrupt the family," Catherine protested. "The family should have thought of that before spending 30 years building their fortune on fraudulent foundations," I said. "There's one more thing," Rebecca added, almost casually. "Emma has also come into possession of information regarding the circumstances of Daniel Blackwood's death in Vietnam. Information that might be relevant to any discussion of Charles's motivations for concealing the truth about family relationships." Victoria's face went white. "What are you talking about?" I met her eyes directly. "I'm talking about the fact that Charles Blackwood killed Daniel Blackwood in Vietnam, and then spent 30 years paying hush money to Daniel's widow and daughter to keep that secret buried." The silence that followed was absolute. Catherine started crying. Michael looked like he might be sick. Victoria stared at me with something approaching horror. "That's impossible," she whispered. "I have military records, witness statements, and photographic evidence," I said. "Charles didn't take care of my mother and me out of guilt over surviving when Daniel died. He took care of us because he was the one who made sure Daniel didn't survive." Harrison was frantically scribbling notes. "These are very serious allegations." "They're not allegations," I interrupted. "They're facts. Charles Blackwood murdered his half-brother in Vietnam, covered it up with military cooperation, and then spent 3 decades supporting the victim's family to ensure their silence." Victoria stood up so quickly her chair fell over. "I need to see this evidence. I need to see proof of what you're claiming." Rebecca pulled out James Patterson's file and spread the contents across the conference table. The military records, the witness statements, the photograph of Charles standing over Daniel's body, everything was there in black and white. Victoria stared at the photograph for a long time, her hands shaking. "Oh God," she whispered. "Oh God, what did he do?" "He killed my father," I said simply. "And then he built his entire life on that lie." Catherine looked up from the documents, tears streaming down her face. "Did Mom know? Did you know about any of this?" Victoria shook her head mutely. "I knew he felt guilty about Daniel's death, but I thought it was survivor's guilt. I thought he was just being generous to his brother's widow." "He was being generous to his victim's widow," I corrected. "There's a difference." The meeting lasted another 3 hours, with Harrison trying to find legal loopholes and my family trying to process the complete destruction of everything they'd believed about their lives. By the end, we had reached a preliminary agreement. The estate would be audited and redistributed based on legitimate inheritance claims. I would receive a significant portion of the family assets as Daniel's rightful heir. Victoria, Catherine, and Michael would retain their shares, but they would be substantially reduced to account for Charles's fraudulent claims over the years. More importantly, the truth would come out. Not all at once, not in a way designed to destroy everyone involved, but gradually, carefully, with consideration for all the innocent people who had been damaged by decades of lies. "There's one thing I need to know," Victoria said as we were preparing to leave. "Why now? Why did you decide to pursue this after all these years?" I thought about her question, about all the pain and confusion that had led me to this moment. "Because I spent 28 years believing I was the shameful secret that had to be hidden," I said. "I spent my whole life thinking I wasn't good enough to be part of this family, that I had to be grateful for whatever scraps of affection and support I received. I let that shame define me, limit me, convince me that I deserved less than everyone else." I paused, looking around the room at these people who had been strangers pretending to be family, and family pretending to be strangers. "But I'm not the shameful secret," I continued. "I'm Daniel Blackwood's legitimate daughter, and I deserve everything that comes with that birthright. I deserve the truth, I deserve acknowledgement, and I deserve my fair share of what my father should have left me." Victoria nodded slowly. "You're right," she said quietly. "You deserve all of that and more. I'm sorry it took so long for the truth to come out." 6 months later, the estate redistribution was complete. I received 40% of the Blackwood holdings, including a significant stake in the family business and the right to use the Blackwood name legally. Victoria, Catherine, and Michael received the remaining 60%, which was still enough to maintain their comfortable lifestyle, but not enough to dominate the family legacy. More importantly, the truth about Daniel's death was revealed through a carefully planned disclosure to military historians and veterans organizations. Charles Blackwood was posthumously investigated for fratricide, and Daniel Blackwood was officially recognized as a victim of friendly fire rather than enemy action. I kept my job at Morrison & Associates, but now I work there by choice rather than necessity. I have my own office, my own apartment on the Upper East Side, and my own sense of identity that isn't built on shame or secrecy. My relationship with Victoria, Catherine, and Michael is still complicated. We're family, but we're family that was built on lies and maintained through mutual deception. Victoria has been surprisingly gracious about the whole situation, perhaps because she understands that she was as much a victim of Charles's lies as anyone else. Catherine and Michael are still processing the revelation that their father was a murderer and their entire inheritance was built on fraud. My mother struggled the most with the truth coming out. She had spent 30 years protecting Charles's secret, and learning that he had killed the man she loved was devastating. But she's in therapy now, working through decades of suppressed grief and guilt. For the first time in her life, she's free to mourn Daniel openly, to acknowledge their marriage publicly, and to be proud of the daughter they created together. As for me, I finally understand who I am. I'm not Emma Walsh, the illegitimate daughter who should be grateful for whatever she receives. I'm Emma Blackwood, Daniel's legitimate heir, Charles's victim, and the woman who refused to let lies define her identity. Sometimes the family secret you're not supposed to know is the one that changes everything. Sometimes discovering the truth about who you really are means destroying the lies that everyone else has built their lives on. But sometimes that destruction is necessary. Sometimes the only way to build something honest is to tear down everything false. I have my father's eyes, my father's determination, and my father's legacy. Charles Blackwood tried to steal all of that from me, tried to make me complicit in covering up his crimes by accepting his charity and keeping his secrets. He failed. The truth came out, justice was served, and I claimed what was always rightfully mine. Sometimes that's the best revenge of all, simply refusing to let someone else's lies become your reality.